Hey, good morning, church. My name is Tony Fernandez. For those of you who do not know me, I serve as an evangelist here in the Broward Church, and it's an honor that you are willing to spend your Sunday morning with us. I want to begin by asking a question. Do you ever notice that things look different when you're looking back at them? You ever notice that when things look very different when you're looking back at them? Like when you think back to your high school years or maybe your middle school years or some of your college years, there were things that seemed so important that now you look back and they feel so insignificant. The concerns you had, the values you had, some of them are even like cringeworthy. You're like, goodness gracious, I cannot believe I used to look like that or act like that. And at the risk of looking like a fool, I want to show you a picture. And this is me in college. Yes, this is me and Cassandra, actually. But do you see what I'm wearing? That is what we call a tall tee. For those of you who don't know what that is, I'll give you an example. This is a tall tee. And I'm going to put it on just so you can see it. People used to wear this. If you used to wear it, can you raise your hand? Yeah, you feel the shame, all of y'all. This is actually just Matt Blair's normal T-shirt. I just borrowed it from him. But anyway, yeah, I used to wear this. Look at that. I mean, some of us. As I was putting it on earlier, I was like, it's gonna mess up my hair. And Cassandra was like, you went from wearing that to not wanting your hair to be messed up. What is going on with you? But anyway, yeah, some of it's cringeworthy. You know, this is Wayne Ferenga. That's cringeworthy. I mean, there's a lot inappropriate about this picture, but man, I mean, looking like somebody at one point thought that was cool. If you ever wore like that, if you ever dressed like that, could you raise your hand? Yeah, some of you are lying. You used to wear like, you know, there are so many things that you look back and you just think, goodness gracious. Looking back, you see things a lot differently. I used to love the movie Cool Runnings. I told somebody it was in my top 5 favorite movies of all time. And Cassandra and I watched it the other day, and I said, this is such a terrible movie. But man, when you look back at things, things just look different. They just look different when you're looking back. When you go throughout your life, things just change. You remember when you were younger, it was so important for that girl to notice you. Or when you were in high school, it was so important for you to get great grades on that one assignment. Or you were trying to get that one job, and it was so important to you. Or you thought, I'm going to marry that one guy. It's going to be amazing. It was so important to you. And now you look back and go, goodness gracious, thank you. I didn't date that person or marry that person. Or thank you, I didn't go to that school, because otherwise I would have looked back and it would look like this. I bet if you made a list of the things, I'm just going to leave this up there. I bet if you made a list of the things that you were concerned about even 5 years ago, it would be radically different than what you're concerned about today. Because when you look back, things look different. You go through that breakup of your very first love, and it hurts so badly. And you look back and you go, man, I'm actually glad I'm not with that person anymore. Because now I get to be with the love of my life. You know, and this is why it's so easy for us to give advice to teenagers all the time. For our teens get this all the time. You know, even though you were a teenager and you were just the worst as a teenager, you look back and you go, you know what? At least I could tell you what not to do in my teenage life. You want to give advice to younger people because you've learned so much. There's just this feeling, you know, you've gone through it. I remember leading the teens. I used to lead the teens here in Broward, and I would tell the teens all the time that high school is about discipline. That it's primarily about discipline. That's not about what you learn. It's about, you know, the math and science and all that stuff is great if you choose one of those fields, but mainly it's about discipline. It wasn't because I was disciplined as a high school student. It was because I had gone through it. And so I could look back on it with some clarity. After you've gone through it, you can look back with some clarity, because once you go through it, when you're looking back, things just look a little bit different. things look a little bit different. And when you're inside the frame of the picture, it's hard to tell what the picture is all about. When you had your first child, or when you started dating for the very first time, or when you got married, or you got your first good job, I bet there's a lot of you who sought out advice from people who had done it before. Because we all know instinctively that after you go through it, you can look back and things just are a bit clearer than they were before. Do you ever wish that you could go back and give your younger self some advice? Like you could go back and say to your younger self, don't get involved in that. Don't miss that opportunity. Don't take that very first sip. Don't do it. Don't do it, or go for it. Try something new. All of us wish that we would be able to go back and tell ourselves something just to change our life just a little bit. Maybe save some money. I would have told myself a bunch of things. I bet I wouldn't have listened. But either way, there's this feeling that you want to improve, because we have this idea that once you go through it, you can look back and things look different. And in a sense, this is the hardest thing about life. What makes life so difficult is that we can never look back at our lives and improve where we've been. What makes life so difficult is that life isn't lived while looking backwards. Life is lived in the present, and what I want to talk about today is this idea that life is lived in pieces. Life is lived in pieces. It's small moments, scene by scene, season by season, each building upon each other to create a project of what you call your life. Your life is the sum of the pieces that you live, and some of those pieces are incredible. They're awesome, they're fun, they're joyous, they bring you great memories, but there are other pieces of your life that are broken, that hurt deeply, that you go back and you think, man, how could I have ever gone through that? They are negative. And so I want to kind of address this idea. What happens when the pieces of your life that have to build into who you are overwhelmingly broken? What happens when they're overwhelmingly broken? What happens when your thought and your mind doesn't go to the happy places but right to the bad places? How do you build a life for good when everything seems to be filled with bad, filled with pain and with sorrow, with disappointment and unmet expectations? Unfulfilled dreams, when your life is filled with rejection or abandonment from those you love, or when your life is filled with the pieces of chronic illness and discouragement. And this is the question we're going to dive into today. Can the sum of broken pieces build a life of good? Can broken pieces build a life of good? This is the question we're going to explore as we look at our very last sermon in this Redefined series. I know we've been getting a heavy dose of the book of Genesis and looking at Joseph's life, but we're going to look at it again today. Matt did a great job a couple of months ago, and yesterday, if you were at the Women's Day, Kim did an incredible job talking about this passage. But we're going to look at it a little bit of a different look today as we turn together to Genesis chapter 50. I want us to come to the conclusion that God alone can put our broken pieces together for good. We're going to look with me at Genesis chapter 50. And keeping in the theme, we're going to start at the end and look back. Here in Genesis chapter 50, we find 11 men. They're kneeling anxiously as they go before the newly appointed sort of prime minister of Egypt. It's a man named Joseph. Joseph has a long history with these 11 men that are kneeling before him. It's a history of pain, of suffering, and of rejection. A history with memories vividly etched in his mind of how they have tormented him. These men were evil to Joseph. They had, in a human perspective, really ruined Joseph's life. But now the tides have turned. They had a lot of power over him, but now Joseph has a lot of power over them. And that's what we find, and what we would expect to find here in Genesis 50, verse 19, is retribution for the crimes of these men. Because the men kneeling before him aren't just men, they are his brothers, who have sold him into slavery, betrayed him on every account, and they are kneeling before him, begging for mercy. But when Joseph breaks the silence, this is what he says, Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 19. It says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and for your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. This is Joseph after the picture, after his life has been built. This is the story after all the pieces have come together, and looking back on his life and some of the worst things human beings can possibly experience, looking back on his life, he is able to speak words of joy and words of comfort and words of forgiveness to the people who put him there. He has a complicated story, and I'm sure you do too. I'm sure there are many of us who are sitting here today who, if we talked, we could shed a lot of tears about our histories. We could go through situation after situation, piece after piece, season after season, and I bet there'd be some with joy, but I bet that a lot of us could share some things that are horrific. Ways that our life did not go the way we planned them to go. And ways that we felt like, how in the world could this possibly have been happening to me? How am I going through this? We live complicated lives with complicated histories, but what I love about Joseph's story is that he has a history similar to our histories. As a matter of fact, it's sort of blown out of proportion how incredibly difficult his history was. But all of us have painful histories. But he is able, at the end of his story, to say, you know what? I can see that all this was happening for good. He says, I could see that God was putting it all together. And really, that's my hope for some of us today, is simply that we will see that God alone can put together our broken pieces for good. That God alone can do it. You and I can't do it. We can't do it by our own effort, but God can. I look at this story and I think about how kindness and mercy can cultivate in the heart of Joseph, even though he is so horribly treated. How can a man who has seen some of the worst of life think that God could put it together for good? How could he speak words of comfort? And it comes from an area of Joseph's life that it's his theology. Often we preach sermons and our goal is for you to change something about your life. And that, I guess that's the goal every single time. But today really the goal is for you to change your thinking about God. Not so much to change the way you have gone through the situations, or to stop trying to fight hard for the difficult times, or to stop mourning for the pains in your life, but maybe to think differently about what God is doing in the midst of your situations. Today our goal is to change the way we think, and Joseph understood something about God that was so profound that God could take broken pieces and put them together for good. Now we're going to go back to the beginning of the story, Genesis chapter 37. We're going to go through this kind of quickly, so take the ride with me. You can look on the screen, or you can jot down, or you can look at your own Bible, but we're going to be looking at a lot of verses. Genesis chapter 37, verse 3. It says this: Now Israel, that's Jacob, Joseph's brothers, Joseph's father, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. And this is, this is the beginning of his story. It led to a hatred from his brothers. Verse 4 says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to them. And then Joseph begins to have some dreams. Genesis chapter 37, verse 6. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and what he has said. Obviously, the brothers who hated him at this time, they hated him for a variety of reasons, but what we see is that they hated him for no fault of Joseph's own. Now, you could say, probably you shouldn't say this to your brothers. Yes, I would agree. But God gave him that dream. And so he told the dream that God had given him. And we don't know if God told him to tell his brothers the dream that God had given him. All we know is that God gave him that dream. And on top of that, here's the other thing that we know for sure, is that it was Jacob's favoritism that made his brothers hate him. And so at no fault of his own, Joseph is hated by his brothers. And so Joseph goes out one day to meet his brothers. And while he goes out, we're making a really long story short, they intended to kill him. They thought, as he's coming out, I'm going to kill this dude because, he's the worst. And so verse 26 of the same chapter, it says this. Joseph said to his brothers, Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, so we're going to sell him into slavery." Our own flesh and blood, his brothers agreed. And so they hated him for no fault of his own, and then his brothers sell him into slavery. They sell him into slavery. This is the first piece of material that God is going to use to build something great in Joseph's life. But how in the world can you and I speculate that something good can come from that? At this point, normally in this passage, I've heard teaching of people teaching this passage, and I'm not trying to disparage any of those teachings, but they say something like, your life might not be as rough as Joseph. At least your life is not as rough as Joseph's. At least you weren't sold into slavery. At least your whatever that you're going through is not as bad as being sold into slavery. And I guess that's true, but I don't know if that's the intention of this teaching. I don't think this teaching is intended for us to compare our sufferings with Joseph's sufferings. I don't even find comfort when I compare my suffering with other people who have it worse than me. It's like when my parents were like, you need to eat because there's kids in Africa who have no food. I'm like, I don't know if that helps me at all here. This is less about comparison and much more about realizing that whatever God has given you, he can build for good. God can build whatever, with whatever materials he has given you or others have given you. This is just a piece. He went from favorite son to kidnapped slave. And he's 17 years old. He's left the safety of his father's home and now is enslaved. And I wonder what your first piece is. What's the piece that God is using to build something beautiful that you could never see that it was beautiful? That you could never tell. Maybe you're going through a divorce and your spouse was unfaithful. Maybe your child is sick and you don't even know why. Maybe you lost your job and you've been working there for 30 years. Maybe you're dealing with infertility or you're going through something that, is just so painful. For me, I remember the first piece of my life. My brother, who was probably my best friend growing up, was diagnosed with a very serious mental illness when I was in middle school. And man, my best friend in a moment was taken from me. And my brother's still alive and is trying to recover, but man, it is difficult to lose somebody to mental illness. But that was my piece. I'm not trying to compare my piece to your piece. You have a piece too. You've gone through something that's horrible. You may have never been sold into slavery, but we all have something that has enslaved our joy, that has taken the joy from us, that has taken the security from us, enslaved our self-worth, something that has brought you to your knees. And you might be going through it right now, and you might be wondering, why in the world is God putting me through this? And I just want to make a note. God doesn't condone this evil. That's not the point. But God always overrules the evil to accomplish something beautiful. And so Joseph's whole world is flipped completely on its head, betrayed by his brothers, all the joys of his home and security that he has living with his father, all of it taken from him in a moment. He's sold into slavery, into the Ishmaelites, and then sold again to the Egyptians, and to a man named Potiphar. And we're going to look at Genesis chapter 39, verse 2. And I love what it says here. It says, the Lord was with Joseph. I love that. Because when we're going through challenging times in our lives, it's easy to believe that God has abandoned us. But I love that our God is not just the God of our success, but he's also a God of our struggle. That God is with us in the victories, but he's also with us in the defeats. Joseph sold into slavery, but God was with Joseph. Verse 4. Joseph found favor in the eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. This seems like a huge step up, but the story continues. Verse 6, and if your name is Joe or Joseph, this is your favorite verse in the Bible. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. Just screensaver. Take a picture, put it on your screensaver. Go into work and be like, guys, I read this great verse on Sunday morning. Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. She attempted repeatedly to seduce him. He rejected every attempt until, verse 11, one day he went to the house to attend to his duties, and none of his household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hands, and he ran out of the house. He's fleeing for immorality, and she standing there holding his cloak. Potiphar comes home, and his wife tells a lie about Joseph. She says this, verse 14, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak behind, and he ran out of the house. And so Joseph is thrown into prison. You know, I'm sure that Joseph might have thought, really? Again, God? He didn't do anything wrong. At least we don't think he did anything wrong. He thinks, I was faithful to my father. I did what he told me to do, and then I was thrown into a cistern and then thrown into slavery. I was faithful to my God. I obeyed whatever he told me to do. I was faithful to my owner, and I was sold into slavery, and then rather I was thrown into jail. And I think here's an important principle for all of us to hold on to. Even the faithful suffer. Your faithfulness doesn't stop the fact that evil still exists in this world. How righteous you've been, how godly you've been, that doesn't stop the evil that someone else can put on you. That doesn't stop the evil of none of this God did. God wasn't throwing him into jail, into prison. God was just trying to figure out, okay, how do I take these broken pieces and build something beautiful? We all suffer the consequence of a fallen world. We all suffer the consequences of our own sin. There is pain and there is struggle, and it doesn't matter if you've been the most faithful person in the whole world. You are still going to suffer. Jesus actually promises us that. In this world, you will have trouble. So Joseph is thrown into prison. He's in prison where the king's prisoners were confined. And again, the Lord was with him. Love that. Chapter 40, verse 1. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and his chief baker, and he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. They go to prison where Joseph is, and it says this, after they had been in custody for some time, verse 5, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who had been held in prison, had a dream that same night, and each dream had its own meaning. It just so happens that there was another dreamer in the jail, and someone who could interpret those dreams. So Joseph tells them what their dreams are about. Joseph interprets their dreams, and I won't go through all of that. It's a wonderful read if you want to read through it. But basically the message is this. The cupbearer, you're going to be restored to your position in the palace, and baker, you're going to be hanged. And so Joseph says it, and it happens, and we're going to go down to verse 14. Joseph, the cupbearer is taken in and brought back to his position, but this is Joseph's plea, chapter 40, verse 14. It says, but when all goes well with you, this is what Joseph says, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. He says, when you get to your master, remember me. Verse 23, The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. This is like the worst. He goes, I've done nothing wrong, but sometimes this is the way life feels. You go, I've done nothing wrong, but here I am, slaving away, thrown into the dungeons of my own intentions, thrown into the dungeons of my own fears and anxiety, and I feel unsafe, and what have I done to deserve this? What have I done? Thrown into jail, thrown into slavery, forgotten by those he's helped. What has he done wrong? And so for 2 more years, he is stuck in prison until Pharaoh has a dream. Chapter 41, verse 1 says, when the 2 years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came out 7 cows, sleek and fat. They grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile. They stood beside those on the riverbank, and the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He has another dream that's similar to this, but he wakes up and he calls in all his wise men, all his interpreters, anybody he can have to just kind of interpret the dream. And the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph after 2 years. He says this, now a young Hebrew, this is the cupbearer, was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dreams. And then things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. So Pharaoh can't find someone to interpret his dreams. The cupbearer remembers, and so he says, hey, Joseph can interpret some dreams. And so Pharaoh wastes no time in securing Joseph, and Joseph is brought into the prison, or out of the prison, to interpret the dream that Pharaoh had. He basically tells him that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And he tells Pharaoh, you need to basically prepare. Verse 37 says, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked him, can we find anyone like this man? One in whom the Spirit of God? Verse 39, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. This is the unbelievable turn of events that happens, that all of us, as we grew up in going to church, remember this great story. From child to slave to prisoner to prime minister. For 7 years, Joseph is put in charge, and he stores away grain. And when the famine hits, he has enough, he has plenty to take care of the people. And not only does he have plenty to take care of the people, but all over the rest of the known world, the Mediterranean world, people are flocking to Egypt to get some food. And lo and behold, everyone comes to Egypt, including Joseph's brothers. And this is where we started, with 11 downcast, fearful men waiting for retribution. And again, we listen to Joseph's response. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You, and I'm sure he means you, those 11, but he could really well mean all the other people who had been so evil to him. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish the saving of many lives. Decades of suffering, trials on top of trials, and now Joseph looks back at the storm he's just come through, and he says something so profound, and something that really could change our life if we hold on to it. He says, I see God was working the whole time. God was working the whole time. And that's the point. I read like 20 verses, or maybe even more than that, and talked for about 20 minutes, all to make the point I'm about to make. None of this, not a single bit of this, not the slavery, not the dungeons, not the murderous threats from his brothers, none of this was too far for God to repair. Nothing is too broken for God to make beautiful. And this is the point of the whole story. is that nothing in your life and nothing in my life and nothing that happens in the lives that we live is too broken for God to piece together and make something just so beautiful. He didn't intend, God didn't do the evil, but when given the evil materials, God made something just so beautiful. God can make all things beautiful. And let me say this, all things are not good, even though God can make them good. All things are not good. It would be a mockery to say to you today that the death of a child is good. That's not good. Cancer is not good. Drug addiction is not good. War is not good. Infertility is not good. Immorality is not good. God isn't sitting in heaven just thinking, wow, man, I need him to mess up here so I could put it all together. That's not what the Bible teaches us. Instead, I love this passage, Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It says this, but we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In the interlineal part of this Bible, it says, when you read each word, it says this, we know, these are 6 phrases, we know all things God works together for good. That's the way it breaks up. We know all things God works together for good. The key idea is this, God works all things together. God is the sole worker. You and I cannot make it good. You are going through something, and sometimes you're going through it and you think, what can I do to get out of it? What can I do to make it better? What can I do so it doesn't look as bad? What can I do so it doesn't feel as bad? Let me drug it away. Let me drink it away. Let me try to abandon it so that it'll all change. You cannot make it better. You cannot make it good. God alone can make the broken pieces good. God works it all together. In the chemistry of the sovereign Lord, God takes the most vile things and put it in the crucible of his wisdom and his love, and what produces is something glorious and something that is good for us in the long term. You may be dying inside here, going through something, the hardest moments of your life, and at each turn, I really believe that God mourns with you. I believe that God mourned with Joseph also. I believe that at every turn, God looked at Joseph and thought, man, this is horrible. You have to go through this. But I'm going to take that material. I'm going to make something really good out of it. I will overrule that evil. And this allows us to rise above the dictatorship of our circumstances. Some of us are just so entrenched in what we're going through right now, but we can rise above it because God is going to build it for good. We don't have to be bound to today's challenges. We know that God will work it out. Joseph, mangled by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, lied, accused about for rape, languishes in prison, but God was working all along. It's his providence. Men may try to ruin you, but I will work it out for good. I love the passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. I just want to reference it. I was given, this is Paul, he says, I was given a thorn in my flesh. It was a messenger of Satan. And then he says that what he learned, though, was a message from God. I love that. The messenger can be from Satan, and the message can be from God. We're going through something where the messenger might have been from Satan, but the message is from God. Something good. God will coordinate, organize all the independently, activities that seem like they can't even be put together. God takes all that broken pieces and smashes them together, and something good happens out of it. God is working all along. It's hard to see the beauty of God's plan before it's all built. I love that. God's amen. Amen. It really is. It's hard to see the beauty of what God is doing before it's all built. And I just want to let you know that some of you may never see the good. You may die a martyr. You may die of a disease that you don't understand how you got. You may never, ever see the good, but that doesn't mean that God isn't working. It may come long after you. Look at the story of Job. You think, how, really? Job's questioning God for 38 chapters. And then God says, stop, I'm about to question you. He goes, you don't know what you're talking about. It reminds us that God's ways are not our ways, and God's plans are not our plans. You can't judge the picture by the pieces. God is building something beautiful, but you can't judge it by a single piece. You can't judge it by what you're going through right now. You can't think, God has ruined my life because I'm going through something bad right now. Remember, when you get through it, you'll be able to look back and God will say, that's what I was doing. That's what I was doing all along. That's what I was doing. When you focus on a piece, there's a little thing I like that I made that I'm excited about. When you focus on a piece, you lose your peace. But it's true. When you're just focused on one piece of your life, you lose your peace. When you're so focused on how that one brother hurt you, how that one situation wasn't the way it was supposed to be, you just lose the peace that God can give you. You lose it all, man. And so I just want to encourage us, we have an opportunity here to redefine our thinking. We have an opportunity here to think about our lives differently than the way we've been thinking about them. We have an opportunity here to not get caught up in every single difficult situation and think that is my whole life. To think that nothing good can come from that. We have an opportunity to be freed from that type of thinking, not because of what we can do, but because of how great God is. What does the passage teach us? It teaches us to love God and let him build our lives. Love God and let him build our lives. Love him and let him build your life. Just keep going forward. Let him build it. And in each step of the way, you will see that God is making something absolutely beautiful. Thank you, church.